When we use the transform tool, so the move, rotate, and scale, it's important for us to keep in mind our orientation of our objects, or essentially which direction it's pointing in. So in order to observe this orientation, we are going to use these axes, or these manipulator handles on my move tool to take a look at that. I have the move tool selected. And by default, if I haven't rotated my object, it is always going to be pointing in the same direction in these three arrows, right? So Y is up and down, this Y axis, which is the green one. X is left and right, this red axis. And Z is forward and back, this blue axis, right? So that's the X, Y, and Z axis. So until I rotate my object, it's going to be always pointing in those three directions, no matter how I move it or scale it. As soon as I start rotating it, however, there might be new directions that these axes point in. By default, depending on how you have your tool set up, you might not notice it. So I'm going to move this, rotate it, switch over to my move tool. Oh, it looks like it hasn't changed at all. But in reality, my object actually has new directions or new concepts of what is forward, back, up and down, and left and right relative to itself. And I can take a look at that by going into my tool settings and changing my axis orientation value here from world to object. And you'll see it actually has a different concept of what forward and back is, up and down is, left and right is, based on how I've rotated it. So I'll rotate it this way instead, switch back to that move tool, now it's pointing in different directions. And so each object has its own local or object space, which is its own kind of concept of what up and down is, forward and back is, and left and right is. But every object can also refer to the world space or the world orientation, which is that constant up and down, forward and back, and left and right that is not going to change in my scene. And so these two spaces is how I can switch and change how I'm manipulating my object, because sometimes I want to take into consideration how my object thinks forward and back is, left and right is, up and down is. And then sometimes I want to move it relative to how the world thinks those directions are. So to further provide this concept, you can imagine this over here, these manipulators over here, are going to be the world axes. So these are the constant ones. This is always going to be forward and back. This is always going to be left and right. This is always going to be up and down, right? X, Y, and Z. Over here, I have an object just like this one, but I've created these little manipulator handles so you can see it as I rotate it. And I'm going to make this manipulator handle a lot bigger, actually. Let's make it bigger so it doesn't obscure it. And you'll notice as I rotate it, what's forward and back, up and down, left and right is changing. And you can kind of imagine if you were piloting a jet fighter or a spaceship, right? Relative to the ship that you're flying in, up and down, forward, back, and left to right is changing as you rotate through space, right? And so there might be something, a forward and back, left and right, up and down that is constant to the world, or you can reference the world, but you're also going to have a local direction that you're pointing in. Okay, so this is really important to consider as you manipulate your objects is which axis orientation you're pointing in. So in order to switch between these, let's go ahead and I'm pressing plus on my keyboard to make that manipulator bigger. In order to change whether I'm in local or my objects orientation or my world orientation is I can come to my tool settings like I just showed before and just switch between object and world. We have a lot of different orientations we could use, but just for simplicity's sake, we're only going to focus on world and object. Those are the two most common you're going to use. So like I said before, I switched to object. Here we go. Pointing in its own local directions and worlds. I'm using the world or constant directions. I can do the same thing with the rotate tool, right? So here with the rotate tool, it's set to the world, switch to object, same thing. And it's the exact same thing with the scale tool. Another way I can switch between these instead of going to the tool settings is I can press and hold the key that is associated, the hotkey that is associated with that transform tool, and hold that with the left mouse button. So if I want to change the orientation, whether I'm doing object or world orientation of the move tool, I can hold W, which is the hotkey for move tool. And while I'm holding that, click on my left mouse button. Ooh, let's go back to over there. You can see I can switch over to object mode. And I can do the same thing. Let's go back to world mode. I can do the same thing with the other tools. So E for rotate. So hold E, left click and drag and go to object mode. Go to the world mode. And of course with scale as well. World mode, object mode. And just to reiterate, I just wanted to let you guys know that this comes into effect once you start rotating your object. Because if you don't have any rotation values, the local or object orientation is going to be the exact same as the world orientation. It might be placed in a different location, right? I might have it centered over here rather than the center of my scene, but their directions, what's left and right, forward and back, up and down, are still the same. So I have it, there's no rotation values, and I'm just going to switch over to object mode. See, it hasn't changed because the local orientation or the object orientation lines up with the world's orientation or the constant orientation.